Now, last weekend, the Mayor of Greater Manchester said that Northern England is in a Hotel California lockdown, and it doesn't look like anyone is going to be able to leave anytime soon. Millions of people are already living under postcode lockdowns, including people in Stalybridge in Greater Manchester, where we're joined from there by Labour's Shadow Work and Pension Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. Thank you very much for being on the programme, Mr Reynolds. So on Monday, the government is reportedly going to be introducing this three-tier lockdown system where people in the third tier, which could well include people in your own constituency, will face the toughest level of restrictions, potentially closing pubs, stopping households mixing anywhere. Is that something Labour supports?
Good morning, Sophie. Look, the first thing I just have to put on the record is the level of anger and frustration that exists in towns and constituencies like mine at the way this is happening. So, there's been leaks to newspapers, there's been no consultation with local leaders. This is not the way to do things. People feel they're being treated with contempt and not with respect, and that is simply not good enough. To answer your question directly, the fact is there are going to have to be further measures, and the reason for that is the government have lost control. Right? They've lost control of the messaging, they've lost control of test and trace, they've lost control of the virus, unfortunately, and that means we're going to have further measures. That wasn't inevitable. That time we got from the lockdown and from the development of what should have been an effective test and trace system should have meant we don't have to get to that position. But the crucial point is this: further restrictions have to come with economic support. The situation for businesses here in my constituency is not acceptable. How can they plan for next week? They've had 9 weeks of very, very restrictive local restrictions. That's had a huge impact on them, of course it has. And now we find out, we will learn tomorrow what is going on. So the Prime Minister's got to get a grip of this. He's got to come to Parliament. But crucially, any further restrictions must come with appropriate levels of support for businesses and people.
I mean, to be fair, the government has announced more support for businesses and people. The Chancellor said the government will pay 2/3 of people's wages if businesses are forced to close. I mean, this is unprecedented. The government's never stepped in before to pay people's wages. Are you demanding too much?
No, it's not good enough what the government have announced. So let's be clear. For 9 weeks now, in constituencies like this one, the restrictions have been that you cannot socialise indoors with people who aren't your immediate family. So you add that to, for instance, the curfew. How can a restaurant or a business trade viably in that environment? And of course, don't forget that we're now so many months into this crisis that all the businesses have had the debt they had to get with the bounce back loans at the beginning. They've had very poor trading for most of this year. They're in a very difficult position. So no, the support is not enough and it must get better. But at the same time, there are other things the government could do. So we haven't yet got sick pay for everybody. The payment that was announced, the £500 for people self-isolating, only about 1 in 8 workers are eligible for that. There's the money, the underspend in the grants that were given to councils. That could be packaged up again and give councils the power to give that out again. So there is much more that needs to be done. But, frankly, we're in this position because of the government's inability to control this properly. And I'm afraid that does mean more restrictions for people. And they deserve support if they're asked to obey those restrictions going forward.
I'm interested in your insight as a local MP in an area that has faced these additional restrictions, as you said, for a long time, 10 weeks or so. I spoke to Andy Birmingham last weekend and he said he thinks that the government is on the verge of losing the north of England. Do you think that there is a real concern now that people might just stop following the rules, that people have reached their breaking point?
It is a worry, to be frank. So at the beginning, we talked, I think, in the country about how there might be lockdown fatigue. That is definitely more of a feature. But the reason for that, Sophie, has been, if you take the last 2.5 months here in Greater Manchester, what you've seen is very significant restrictions on people's lives. Can't see family members, can't visit loved ones in care homes. Businesses, pubs can't trade properly. And at the same time, no additional support. And as well as that, the infection rate going from 50 infections in 100,000 to, in this area now, over 200 infections in 100,000, and in central Manchester, over 500 infections. So people are looking at it and saying, well, we just don't think the government's got a grip on this, but we do need them to follow the rules. We still want the government to succeed. We want them to get a grip on this, but they're just not doing that at the minute. And part of that is, how contracts have been handed out for test and trace, getting nowhere near what we need to be. I look, just over there to Wales, and what they've been able to do is far superior to what we've got in England. So there are real lessons the government have got to learn. They've got to get a grip on this, because they are starting to lose people. And there is resentment, to be frank. There's resentment about the north-south divide in some of these local restrictions, and you can see that coming across. So unless the Prime Minister gets a grip of this, it will get even more difficult.
I'd appreciate a really clear answer on this next question. The 10 p.m. rule, where pubs, restaurants have to close at 10 p.m, has come in for an awful lot of criticism, some people saying it's counterproductive. There's a vote on it next week. Does Labour support the 10 p.m. rule?
Well, to be honest, the 10 p.m. rule is going to be rendered obsolete by what we hear tomorrow, because we'll probably see a complete shutdown.
We don't know, do we? That's genuinely not what I asked as well. Does Labour back the 10 p.m. rule or oppose it?
We think we have to be restrictions in hospitality, yes, but the crucial point is there's got to be support with those restrictions. Look, in terms of where affections are taking place...
Sorry to come in again. I do apologise for coming in again, but I'm still genuinely not clear. Does Labour back the 10 p.m. rule or not?
Yes, we back restrictions in hospitality as long as they've got the economic support that should go with that. But as I say, I think what we'll see on Monday is the situation will move on anyway for so many businesses. The crucial thing is the environment for a business like a pub right now, it's not a viable one, and that is the problem that the government has to solve.
So you'd vote in favour of the 10 p.m. rule?
Well, it's not a vote specifically on the 10 p.m. rule. It's a vote on all of the package of measures affecting areas like this. Now, when the infection rate is as it is in a constituency like mine, you can't be arguing for less restrictions. That's just not feasible if you look at where that progress is going. So it's not a specific vote on the 10 p.m. rule, but on the package of measures overall. And as I say, the reality is we have got to accept that more measures will happen because the government have lost control of the situation. The crucial thing is making sure there's the right level of support to go with those restrictions, because at the minute there isn't, and that's what's not acceptable. OK. Now, later on the programme, we're going to be speaking to the Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick. Labour's calling for an investigation into him. What's that about? Well, basically, the measures that the Department of Communities and Local Government have been offering to local towns, the regeneration money, Robert Jenrick is obviously in charge of that as the Secretary of State. That's a programme that towns like mine here in Stalybridge very much wanted to be part of, and we didn't get the money. And now we find out that where that money has gone has been very much directed by ministers to what look like Conservative electoral battlegrounds. So we always knew when the data came out, you could compare the different parts of Greater Manchester, for instance, that got the money, and it wasn't clear why we didn't get it, but a place like Cheadle down the road did. But now we know that ministers have directly tried to influence that. They have, in Robert Jenrick's case, sat on the local board that then made the application to and then tried to cover that up. So the whole question has always been quite a murky one as to how this money was allocated. The Secretary of State has questions to answer, and an investigation is the right way forward.